All right, we'll go ahead and turn this over to David. David, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Marcos. And thanks to World at Work again for hosting our webinar today. So just in the way of introductions, I'm Dave Kohari. I run advisory services and customer success here at Argano. I've been in the sales performance management space, let's call it, for about 25 years in a variety of roles. And I've also spent some time running a customer success organization for a global software company. So I'll be bringing some of that perspective into today's conversation too. Hunter?
Yep. Hey, everybody. Hunter James. I'm the general manager of the sales planning line of business here at Varicent. Prior to joining Varicent, spent a little over a decade in consulting around sales performance management. A little bit of an odd bird in that space because, as everybody on this call knows, that space was created around incentive compensation. I was really focused on the territories, the quotas, and the capacity elements of consulting for a lot of that time on that side of the house. So looking forward to our conversation today.
All right. Thanks, Hunter. George?
Hi, George Lagone, partner at RevenueShift. We're boutique sales effectiveness consultancy based out of Chicago. Have been in and around professional services my entire career. The bulk of it consulting commercial organizations. Our charge at RevenueShift is really helping companies operationalize their go-to-market strategy. So everything from segmentation, organization design, targeting, account planning, comp quotas, territories, and all the change management documentation that goes along with it.
All right. I am very much looking forward to today's conversation. Hunter and George, I've known for many years. I know it's going to be a great discussion. Let's jump into it. All right. So I always like to start these conversations with a quote. This one seemed particularly relevant. It's not necessarily a quote. It's more, I guess, a lyric from the great 21st century poets, Coldplay. And from their song "The Scientists," and it's, I think the relevant lines are: nobody said it was easy, but nobody ever said it would be this hard. And when you think about some of the things that we're going to talk about today, I find that that statement compelling as we continue to try to work with customers around solving some of these challenges. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the relationship between quotas, compensation plans, recruiting, retention, the complexity that is inherent in these areas, especially when you start to layer in these ideas around hiring seasonality. So we'll talk all about that, and hopefully, what you'll get out of today's session is a few things. One is some ideas, strategies around like how do we address recruitment, retention, quota attainment. How do we think about, from a tactical perspective, attracting like top sales talent, especially when we start to think about some of that seasonality? How do we optimize our compensation plan so we retain our top performers and we're able to attract that new talent? How do we think about capacity planning and onboarding and all of these other things that we need to layer into this conversation? And then finally, hopefully we'll give you some organizational blueprints for how you drive and measure sales performance improvement in these areas. Now, I wouldn't be a consultant if I didn't love conceptual frameworks. So, and we're going to be sharing some with you today. So I'm going to kick things off with our conceptual framework around sales performance management. And so when we come in and talk to customers about sales performance management, it really falls into kind of three main areas, if you will. So it starts with planning, right? Sales planning, territory planning, account segmentation, quota setting, plan design, expense budgeting, all of the things that Hunter and George just talked about that they work with customers on helping to address. So that's the planning aspect. From there, there's execution, right? This is the incentive compensation management in sales performance management that Hunter was talking about earlier, right? The ICM and SPM. So this is, how do I get all the data that I need so that I can pay people accurately and on time and give them good, transparent reporting? And how do I continue to maintain all of that foundational information throughout the year as I'm going through that payment process? And then finally, analysis, right? Now that I have data sitting in all of these areas, how do I mine that data, and serve information up to my leadership that helps us make better decisions about the program and the business. And in today's discussion, we're probably going to focus a little bit on the left-hand side of this framework. So really kind of drilling into the planning and analysis. But obviously, it's important to think about this holistically when you think about sales performance management overall. Okay, with that as the foundation, let's get into it. So financial planning, goals and budgeting. So it's planning season. I'm sure some of you are in this process right now. It's that annual event where the CEO and the CFO get together with the board, start thinking about top line revenue goals. The CFO is probably starting to think about like, how much is this going to cost us? What's our cost of sales target? And all of this is in service of eventually delivering this information to our CRO and our chief people officer so that they can start to take that in action on it. And I guess we'll pause here for a poll of the audience. What quarter do you start this planning process in? And I would say what fiscal quarter, knowing that some of you are not on a calendar year. So what fiscal quarter do you start this process in, just out of curiosity? We'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay. All right. All right. Looks like Q3 is a clear winner here. Which I guess, Hunter, when you look at these poll results, what are your thoughts? And I guess talk a little bit, obviously, about how you're working with customers and execs. Trying to figure out how do we set goals and budgets.
Yeah. So these results don't surprise me. We've all seen this over the years, where you start the third quarter really just to get all that data together. So before the actual planning process starts in good faith, while the C-suite are all meeting with the boards to come up with the number that is always going to be higher than last year for revenue, and the number that's always going to be lower than last year for the costs and the expenses, you're trying to grab everything and put it all together. And then when that process starts, more often than not, it's very sequential. We're looking at a chevron right here, and I don't think that's the wrong way. I'd be curious, David, George, from y'all's perspective, do you more often than not see organizations that are going through the path of doing this in a sequential manner? Once a year, jamming everything in and pushing everything through.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that when you sit there and you think about it, and we'll get into this here in a few minutes, but business changes a lot more than once a year. And over the course of 6 months that you're going through from starting the data collection all the way to the plan, your business has probably changed from that first day. Your theories and your hypotheses change because every company, at least I know in the software space, your biggest quarter is your last quarter of the year. Incentives drive those behaviors. So you're making plans with, half of the sheet of music that you're going to be playing from next year. That's super challenging. David, we were talking about it when you were working with your FP&A team while you were on the software side. I'd love for you to share that story of what your process looked like.
Yeah, no, I mean, so luckily, I guess, or unluckily, perhaps, depending on how you want to look at it, we also started the process usually in late Q3, I would say, or often early Q4. And yeah, I mean, to your point, Hunter, I was always struck by like how hard it was for our FP&A team to balance this model between what the forecast looked like versus what was actually happening on the ground. And when you thought about all of the work that it took to just keep the model up to date, because I'm sure everyone deals with this too, right? Like the data sits in a bunch of different places. Sales and sales operations has a piece of it. I had a piece of it from customer success perspective. Professional services and supports had little bits and pieces of all these ingredients. So like trying to get all of those folks to the table on a regular basis to make sure everything was aligned and updated. And I think the other thing that I personally ran into, and I know my colleagues did too, is we're constantly trying to figure out like what are the right benchmarks and ratios for any of this stuff, right? Like it seemed like, and perhaps the cynical person in me, the cynical side of me is that in the parentheses there, we're benchmarking against, non-comparable businesses. I always felt that way, right? Like when you started to dig or scratch into the surface of like, well, where did you get that ratio or where did you get that benchmark? It was really hard to find apples to apples comparison that were, aligned with what our business looked like and how our business works. So yeah, it was an extremely challenging exercise in terms of like just getting all the data and keeping it up to date, but also just accepting the output as being valid, right?
Yeah. I mean, I wish we could do a show of hands here and we were actually in the room with everybody on this webinar, because I mean, I'd be curious to hear from everybody. How much of the process do you spend waiting for inputs from other sides of the house as you're going through this process? And how often do you get those and go, I don't think this is right?
Yeah.
But don't really have much of an ability to go back and ask the right questions because frankly, the process just doesn't allow for it. And the data is so suspect that even if you did, everybody could read it slightly different ways.
Right. That's exactly right. I think the other thing, Hunter, too, that I experienced, and again, I wish we could do the show of hands, is like there's compression here too, to your earlier point.
Yeah.
It's like I'm playing this game of chicken between like I need to get this process started, but I want more actual data in order to start the process. And I think, but I know the longer I wait on these chevrons, the more I'm putting, some of the things that George is about to talk to us about, that happens in the next stage of this at risk because there's just simply not enough time to do that. So I guess with that, George, maybe we can talk about like, what's it like to be on the receiving end of these goals and budgets and what happens next?
Yeah, it's such a cascade, right? That comes out of this. And it just ends up landing all the way at the head of all the way down on the head of salespeople, right? And no one wants their plan, their goal, their metrics, their territory more than them. I think sometimes there's maybe, not going to say unrealistic, but aggressive expectations of when that's going to come out, right? And when you kind of step back and discuss what we're discussing now, and considering the end-to-end process of it, this pie in the sky idea that we're going to go through this sequential process and everything's going to be tick tied and ready to go on January 1, it's virtually a statistical impossibility, right?
Right.
For it to happen. But yeah, you get this. You get your plan that comes in, and maybe a best case scenario, you're getting it, late November, early December. It's still going to get tweaked. After that, you have to determine. Okay, now, we've got the big number overhead. Who's that going to get allocated to? If I need to know how that's allocated, I have to understand the growth numbers and where I'm going to go get it in what territories or segments. I have to look at my people right now. Say, hey, who of these people are high risk to leave? What gaps am I going to need to fill? How do I retain the people who are truly important to it, right? That's that no attrition piece. Oh, and by the way, if I know they're going to leave, I should have started 6 months ago getting the person ramped so we could start January 1 and be off and running. Not realistic, but that's that's how it would need to happen. Strategic talent acquisition. This is making sure that you are not going after, there's times of the year you could get first tier talent. There's times of the year you could get third tier talent, right? And you have to be cognizant of when those seasons are. And doing things too late in the year can put you in this place where you're paying premium dollars for third tier talent.
Right. Yeah. I think sorry, go ahead, Hunter.
I was going to say, one of the things that I've seen over the years, it's really important to say the uncomfortable thing out loud when you're going through the planning process. Mm-hmm. People are going to leave. We know they are. Absolutely. You probably know who is going to leave, who's unhappy. Say it. Because if you don't, and you go through the planning cycle and haven't raised your hand, you're going to end up flat-footed. I often see that organizations, there's 3 ways to make decisions and a plan: your head, your heart, or your gut. And the reality is, in this kind of process, without technology, without collaboration, 9 times out of 10, more of the decisions are being made by gut than by head. And the scary part about that is it happens over the years, and it's a cascading impact. And those decisions that were made with the gut because you didn't have time, all of a sudden move up to your heart. And your leaders believe those are the right approaches and those are the right decisions because you've done it that way for so long.
And you're selling yourself.
Yeah. You've convinced yourself. And one of the hardest pieces, and George, it sounds like what you're saying here, is we've got to take a step back. We've got to use the data. We got to use our heads first as we go in the decision-making process.
Yeah, I think, to draw from my personal experience, Hunter, I would say I'd follow on with one of your points too, which is, people are going to leave, right? And actually, we don't like to talk about this, but there are some people that probably should leave, right? Like there are some folks we probably should say like, hey, we invite you to pursue excellence elsewhere, right? Like this is not the right role for you. This is not the right organization for you. And that can be a hard conversation to have, but you have to have it so that you can make sure, to your point, that when you're going into this exercise, you have a really good accounting of like, what do I need? Right? How many people do I actually need? And how do I focus on making sure that I retain the right people, but also, to George's point, get in that time machine, go back 6 months and hire a bunch of really smart people that I need to bring into the organization and onboard so I have enough time. And I think that's, to me, when I've worked with leaders or even from my personal experience, the hardest part about this is that not just that like all of these things that George has walked us through, they're all happening at the same time. The other thing is like, they're all connected, right? So if I get guidance from my CEO that says I have to increase top line targets, well then I have to account for that uplift somehow in territories and quotas. So if I'm going to increase the number of territories, well then I need more people, right? Or I could try to spread that increase across the existing territories. Well, guess what? You're going to make a bunch of your existing reps pretty unhappy if that's it's just like work harder. So then maybe I get undesirable attrition. So I have more salespeople leaving. And so it feels like we really should be thinking about this differently to all the things that you guys have been saying around like, is this a sequential thing? That of sort of disconnected events, or is it really like a bunch of interconnected like processes and activities and governance that we should, and there's sort of a new paradigm that we should really be thinking about this. And I guess I know, Hunter, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, so maybe I could put you on the spot and ask you to, I know you guys have been thinking about this and you've come up with your own framework.
Which we love our frameworks, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So actually, Dave, I remember conversations you and I having outside of the hotel in Chicago at the World at Work conference.
Yeah.
Many times over the years, reminiscing of projects that we had worked on and also kind of marinating in the challenge that we couldn't quite verbalize of the fact that we are guilty. The 3 of us on this call, being in consulting for as long as we have in the SPM space, we are guilty of building those slides. The big boxes that says target setting, thin little line that says data, big box that says quota, thin little line that says data, capacity, territory, crediting, compensation. Chevron charts, boxes and lines, we're guilty. And we were all wrong and knew we were wrong over all that time. But how do you piece it together? And at Varicent, we think of it more like gears. And if you think about it in the siloed approaches that it's historically been, you're throwing a whole bunch of gears on the table, but they're not touching each other. There's no engine that is moving whatsoever. But when you think about the process a little more holistically and you flip it on its head, when that tops down budget comes through, 2 things are out there. Here's what you can spend and here's what you need to make. Number is going to go up on what you need to make. Number is going to go down on what you need to spend. And that's not just a quota conversation. That's a territory conversation. Who are we going to sell to? What are we going to sell and why? And who should do that selling? It's a capacity conversation. As you're doing that, salespeople are not in this out of the goodness of their heart. They're in it because they want to make money. That's why people go into sales. They're placing a bet on themselves. So why would we wait until the end of the cycle, until territories and goals and everything are set to come up with our comp plans? We shouldn't. And in fact, compensation should certainly be a part of that conversation, because the compensation gear turns some of the cost levers. And maybe you end up seeing, oh, we could hire more people if we shift this or that. Or we actually need to hire less people because we can get more out of them if we spend more money here, there, or the other. And the other just universal truth: business changes. It changes a whole lot more than once a year. So the other broken piece is annual planning is not enough. This is not a planning process at all. This is the engine for your business. You walk out of your house every single day, you expect to put your car in reverse and get out of the driveway. If one of these gears falls out, let's say a sales rep leaves, easiest example to think of. You don't just have to hire somebody new. Well, we've got a coverage gap with our territories. How do we assign that out? People aren't in and out of the goodness of their hearts, so we got to pay them for doing more. What are we going to do? Is it a spiff? Is it a comp plan component? So on and so forth. Our board's going to want to know what our plan is. How are we going to communicate it? All of these things have cascading effects and impacts across them.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this, and George too. I really like this framework, right? Because it does start to speak to the interconnectedness of all of these capabilities. And I also think it starts to align all of us around the idea that this is a problem that, as we're going to talk about here in a bit too, it's not just a capabilities problem, it's also a governance and ownership and measurement problem. And we're just now, I think, starting to your point, wrap our arms around like, who should really be thinking about this holistically and who should own it organizationally. And, I think one of the things that we were talking about in preparation for this conversation too, Hunter, was some of the analyst data that you'd been looking through. So maybe you could share with us some of the insights that you've gotten out of those.
No doubt. And one of the other things is I recognize some of the names that are actually in this call. It's good to see some familiar names and faces here. I'm guessing that most of y'all look at that last slide, the conversation that we've been having, and go, yeah, we know this is important. No duh. This is the way that we should be doing it. But the question always, when you're sitting in that chair going, yes, this is a problem, is, do my leaders care enough about it to solve it? And we are sitting in a really visceral moment in time for CEOs. So over the course of the past decade, SBI and Gartner and 1,000 other analysts have been doing reports. SBI came out with one this year where I think they polled 1,000, 2,000 different companies and did their own research as well. There's a 19% decrease, 19% in companies that are growing profitably. So judging, I wish there were 100 people because head math is not my strong suit. But I'm going to assume there's 100 people on this so that I can have good head math. That means 20 of the people sitting on this call are sitting at one of those companies that is not growing profitably right now. Okay, so what's the other side of the coin? That's kind of scary. Sales and marketing costs have increased 68%. Thanks to March 15th, 2020, everybody's market changed. Mm-hmm. Sellers were then sitting behind their desk at their computer figuring out, oh my gosh, this LinkedIn thing, not only is it a good place to prospect, look at all these jobs that are out there. Maybe I should reach out. And because the way that we work, the way we operate has changed, Marketing budgets have gone through the roof because there's so much noise out in the marketplace now. They're having to figure out new and unique ways to get in front of people, and those cost money. And every time a seller leaves, there's that ramp period that George talked about that is incredibly impactful. So what you're also seeing is that even those companies that are growing, there's been a 50% drop in the growth rates. So companies that have historically grown at 20% year over year, 10% year over year, now it's 5%. I would nearly guarantee that everybody on this call, there's some sort of transformation project that is going on within your organizations to address these challenges. And that framework that we talked about, the conversation we've already had and will have, are key elements to solving for this. So not only do you have the right to ask for a seat at the table, you belong there.
Yeah, I mean, I think our, sort of our own experiences, as George and Hunter and I have been talking about this experience, and these are direct quotes from like executives that we've been working with, right? So I think everyone knows, hopefully you all know, capital is no longer cheap, right? Like we're not living in a world of low interest rates where you can just go out and and find a bag of cash on the corner anymore. And to Hunter's point, right? Like there's no more growth at all costs. Every conversation we're having with executives is now like we have to manage simultaneously what that top line number looks like while also paying attention to what's happening at the bottom line. And Hunter said this earlier, and I think it's true, like the pace of change in businesses today, this idea that you can sort of just do this once a year and forget it, those days are gone, right? Like the plan is changing. And let's be honest, those days never really existed. We just sort of fooled ourselves into thinking we could do this once and set it and forget it and just come back to it year over year. But as everyone on the phone, everyone on the call knows, like, that's just not the reality of the situation. And I think we're finally catching up to that idea of, so we all know this, there's executive support, everyone's focused on it. I think, it's really opened up an opportunity for us to, how do we fix it, right? And I think, as we talked about, it really starts with ownership, and then that ownership is supported through measurement and management. And if I think about my own journey and, to bring some of my experience, sales operations is a thing now, right? It's been a thing for a few years. And I think that was sort of the beginning of like, okay, we need to address some of these challenges. But sales operations was primarily, a conversation around sales and managing the funnel and that, that piece of it. But as we've started to see this, sort of shift in and focus more on the bottom line, it's really driven the direction and the evolution more towards what we're seeing or calling revenue operations, and starting to think about like not just sitting at the intersection of sales and the chief people officer or sales, even in the CFO. It's really how do I bring all of these stakeholders to the conversation so that I can really focus on both this top line and bottom line discussion simultaneously. And as you might imagine, as you're seeing that shift, there's always this conversation where we're like, well, okay, great. We get it. There's an answer. It's revenue operations. How do we sell it to leadership? How do we measure it? How do we know that it's working? And I think, George, it would be great if you could take us through kind of your perspective on that as you've been working with customers, and executives, like how is RevenueShift going out and setting it up?
Yeah, and you teed it up great there, David. It's this idea of RevOps is something that the three of us live every day, right? And the migration from sales ops to RevOps. This is something that's been going on in one way, shape, or form for probably the last 35 years, and it's really just a cascade of trends. I would say of trends, but of evolution. Right, where we're now looking at, okay, sales ops is enough, need to be tied into both top line and bottom line, right? And top line means also top of funnel and marketing, right? all of these pieces kind of coming together under this banner of RevOps, under this banner of a chief growth officer, which is a new hot term, right? It was chief revenue officer 5-7 years ago, and kind of what should be getting folded into their purview, right? Is it sales? Is it sales ops? Is it top line, bottom line, top of funnel, et cetera, right? Where these things don't neatly fit into a CFO role or a head of sales role, et cetera. And these are evolutionary, right? We're migrating to the chief growth officer and RevOps right now. And prior to that, it was, okay, sales ops being a ubiquitous function across all industries, right? Where maybe, just really like pharma and tech were doing it, kind of led out these really like big commercially driven organizations and industries. And before that, it was role specialization, right? The idea of having an AE and an AM and customer success and implementation folks, right? This is kind of the next wave of that, the next piece of maturity in commercial operations. And we live it every day like it's normal, but we tend to forget that, and this is true with our clients, they're still getting up the curve a lot of times on sales ops. They're still getting up the curve a lot of times on role specialization, right? Especially with more traditional industry, founder-led companies, right? You guys talked about it before. We've always done it this way. Had something that, it's always worked this way. Low turnover, act like family, et cetera. The willingness to change and move along this, we're still trying to bring them from 0 to 1, not from 1 to 2, right? A lot of times.
Yeah. So we have a question out there, and I think this is super relevant to your topic right now, George. Providing some examples of strategic retention strategy to employ with sales talent. Thoughts of embedding retention levers into the comp plan, ad hoc. I think of this, I'm guessing you and I probably will be aligned here. So let's go out on a ledge and just roll with it.
Yeah.
So I think there's an upfront piece. Again, planning guy, can't help it, which is collaboration. One of the things that I've seen the most strategic go-to-market organizations I've worked with embrace, and this is terrifying, but they've embraced it, which is engaging the field org in the conversation around the territories and the goals. Have that as a piece of your process. Yes, sellers are sandbaggers. We all know that. But the reality is, if you can connect compensation to the goals, then all of a sudden you're cooking with gas, because sales reps really, they're in it because they want to make money.
Right.
And if you provide the visibility and collaboration with them during the upfront planning process, they buy in. They're less likely to go running for the hills if Q1's tough, because they planned for that. They knew that. And they provided that direction to you as you were going through the process. And I'm sure from a comp plan perspective, after you've done that, George, you probably have some ideas as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We always kind of bring it to our clients when we're going through commercial transformations with them, right? That bring your highly influential salespeople to the table, let them in on the conversation, make them part of our project team so that they know the what, the why, and kind of why we're doing this, right? And they propagate those messages. Formal communications are great, but there's nothing like a highly networked high performer out there to really bang the drum for you. Is a really big piece. But just like take the transformation away, just run of the mill average year. The quotas got higher. Why? What market conditions are driving this? What changes to our expectations are driving this? No one wants to hear that their quotas go up. They know what's going to happen. It does every year. Show everyone the math, right? You could not like it at the end of the day, but if you understand it, like you said, odds are they're not on LinkedIn then looking for a job at the end of Q1, right? Because they know there's a plan. They know there's a method to the madness. And I think it goes back to your comment, Hunter, right? The honesty. Right. That's looking your salespeople in the eye and saying, this is what we have to deal with. Right. I've got it written at the top of my page. I prepped this, but it was be simple, be honest, be realistic, right? About what you're doing. And it goes to so many things, right? When you're communicating your plan, is it attached to your strategy? Yes. Make sure it's really crisp, really clear, small things. Be honest. Throughout the year, we're sitting here talking again about, hey, beginning of year, why are quotas changing, right? Guess what? You've got to do that again at the end of Q1, the end of Q2, or whenever things change, right? Market conditions have changed. Hey, we overshot on the quotas. Like, we did our best. We still overshot. We're adjusting down, right? Because XYZ thing happened. And the be realistic piece of this, that is, and that's really executive management looking in at themselves and saying, hey, things did change. We have this number out there. It is not going to happen, right? I know this is easier said than done, right? When I'm way oversimplifying this. But being honest and saying, like, look, that's not going to happen. We live in a different world than we did 2 weeks ago. So now we have to change things for us. We have to communicate that message out. Again, be honest with people, be upfront with people, and you keep that retention up.
I think I obviously agree wholeheartedly with what you both are saying. I think Hunter's word "terrifying" is right, though. You know, like when I talk to executives about this, and even I mean, in my own personal experience, the idea that I would include my team in setting their targets and deciding how they're going to get compensated is 10 years ago. You get what you get, right? Like, we went into a room, we designed this thing, it's going to be great. Here you go, off to the races. But I do think, to your point, George, and Hunter, you said this too, we're operating in a different world now, right? And you have to bring everyone along, and you can't do it without honesty and transparency, to your point. And it's, talking through some of this, George, and when you shared some of this information with us, I really like the focus on the seller, right? I like this idea, like, that we're taking, we're looking at span of control and ramp time and turnover rates, and we're taking sentiment of the sellers. These are things that I think are important to the question of, like, how do I make sure that I'm going to retain my best people, right? Well, you ask them and you make sure that the things that you're asking them to do, they can control, and then they can get paid appropriately on those things. So, but I also like, and this, I don't know, the both of you, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Compensation cost of sale was always something I threw on a slide for years and years, and no one asked me about it, right? Now, everyone asks me about it, and it's, and it's to Hunter's earlier point, right? Like, this idea that we could just grow and grow and grow, we didn't care about the bottom line. Those days are over, right? Like, everyone's like, how much is this going to cost? How can I wring every bit of top line revenue out of every dollar that I spend on the bottom line, right? So,
yeah. And I think one other thing, so for something really tactical and actionable that anyone on this call could go and do tomorrow that helps with retention, account for seasonality of your business in your goals. So if you pay out on a quarterly basis and you assign accelerators and things like that, don't evenly spread it over the course of the 4 quarters. Look at your historical results, spread it based on the seasonality of how your buyers buy, so that sellers have an opportunity to earn and hit accelerators even in those quarters they are historically light. That keeps them getting up in the morning. That keeps them in seat because you were thinking about them and making it fair over the course of the year.
Yeah, I think for me, if I start to pull out some themes from the conversation that we've been having today, it's there's a couple of things, right? One is, obviously, hopefully this is coming through clearly. We need to stop thinking about planning and analysis as an event on a Chevron time frame. If you go back to to the original conceptual framework of, like, planning, execution, and analysis. Planning and analysis should not just be something that happens in the second half of the year, right? Really, what this should be is every quarter you're looking at all three of those elements and you're going through that operationally, because that's how the business actually works, right? Like that's how the go-to-market team works. To Hunter's point, or maybe George said this, like the ground is shifting every day, right? Like someone gets acquired and suddenly your account, suddenly your accounts are thrown into disarray. You can't wait a year to figure out what that impact is going to be and how you're going to adjust and course correct. And we shouldn't be waiting a year to have that conversation to be able to provide that transparency. I think the other thing is George, to your point, sales operations is kind of the first step, right? Like, and a lot of organizations are still here, and that's great, right? Like figure out, if you don't have it today, how do you bridge that gap between the CRO and the CFO, so that you start to draw the goals and budgeting exercise that Hunter walked us through and the comp and capacity exercise that George walks us through. How do we bring that together and start having that conversation in the middle? But even better than that, or I shouldn't say better, but the next sort of evolutionary step beyond that is like building a revenue operations function that sits in the middle of all of these organizations and all of these leaders, so that you're bringing everyone to the table and you're really acting as the glue, right? The glue and what we like to call the single source of truth. Revenue operations owns all of these pieces, and therefore it becomes the foundation to drive both that kind of top line and bottom line conversation across the organization. Hunter, you used the word terrifying. I'll reuse it. I'll reuse it again. It's like, how do we take the fear and the confusion out of this planning exercise? Because I know everyone on this, on this call today, you probably feel that, right? Every year around this time, you start to get that anxiety of like, oh no, we've got to go through this horrible exercise of pulling all this information together and trying to make sense of it. So, Hunter, George, any sort of final thoughts before we answer some other questions?
So if you think about RevOps as the conduit between finance and sales leadership, one of the recommendations, again, that I would make to anybody on this call, if you're looking at that journey, if you're looking at those gears going, yes, this is the way we should be thinking about it. RevOps right now, George, I'm going to ask you, because you're knee deep in it with a lot of clients. Yeah. Is there a place where it typically lives?
So there are places where it typically lives.
I love this question, by the way.
And then there's a follow-on that's where should it, right?
That's right.
And what I see is very often it either sits in sales or sits in finance, right? And I think the balance is slightly tipped towards finance, is what I see. I would make an argument that it should be in neither. And ideally would sit somewhere outside of it, either rolling directly into a chief growth officer, a chief revenue officer, assuming they are not a true chief revenue
sales leader,
right? Not just a sales leader, right? True CRO, rolling up to that office and being kind of independent of both sales, finance, and to be honest, marketing as well, is where I'd love to see it more often.
Yeah, and to George's point, right now, unfortunately, it tends to live in different places at every organization. And if you are trying to drive some of this change, what I would do is figure out where it lines up. If you do have the Office of Revenue Operations, if it lines up to sales leadership, they're going to care about the top line number. So take your argument, frame your argument in a way where it's really focused on top line for how you want to retain your sellers, why that's important to them. If it rolls into finance, then it's going to be about bottom line. And one of the levers that I've seen organizations and folks who are trying to drive change use well is the cost of hiring new reps. The time it takes for them to be productive, That's a really important metric if revenue operations rolls into the CFO, because you're speaking their love language at that point.
Yeah.
You're talking about maximizing the investment that they have at the lowest cost envelope that you can.
Yeah, David, my kind of parting thought here, looking at this kind of matrix for RevOps, is people who are part of this process, assuming that you get to kind of this kind of networked ongoing feel. There's still a ton of data going back and forth. Understand that not one of you has the killer metric that drives all of this. It is guidance. It is informative. One of you made the point earlier that everyone reads pieces of data differently or reinterprets them. It is one of many, right? Compensation cost of sale, isn't it? Net promoter score, isn't it? Your overall strategy, isn't it? What the market wants, isn't it? All of these things kind of have to come together just the same way that people do.
Makes sense.
No, I think that's that's exactly right. And if you couldn't tell, I'm always excited when there's a conversation around like governance and who should own these functions. Because I selfishly, I feel like customer success has been going through a similar evolution recently, right? Where for years and years, I think, and in fact, the first place that I ran customer success, I reported directly to the CEO. And then, it became sort of a chief customer officer. But I would say, 8 times out of 10 today, when you talk to a CS leader, they're aligned to the CRO. Why? Because they're responsible for retention and expansion. And so, to Hunter's point, you got to know your audience and you got to know what's important to them. And I think it's an exciting / terrifying time to be in organizations today, because I do think the ground is shifting a bit, and there is like this sort of reorganization of principles and what we care about and what we focus on from a company perspective. So
we're using the word terrifying a lot here.
I know. We started off with kind of a downer quote from Coldplay, ending on a downer note with terrifying.
Oh, that's right. We were joking that Dave was like, we need to come up with a more upbeat song. And I said, well, we can't use Coldplay then. For the end here.
Sorry, go ahead.
I am seeing another question here that I'm guessing is a little bit based in fear, which is, George, you talked about, I talked about, Dave talked about, annual planning is not enough. But this question is, but it's really, really hard. How on earth could we possibly move from this once a year process that takes us 6 months and is riddled with risk and pain to do it more frequently? And I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah. George, you want to take that first?
I can. Honestly, I think it kind of goes back to the matrix you showed before, right? Is to have a central point for people, for a set of folks who's really kind of managing this, systems that are responsible for this, right? So it's not, okay, things changed. We need to start that annual process effectively, like mid-year, and do it again, right? You want to get to a point where you have actual information and everyone connected to it such that you can be nimble. I know this, again, sounds really easy, but you don't want to start that process again mid-year, right? You want everyone to have access to, okay, hey, the world changed. Here's the numbers or the actions that happened, why? And RevOps is sitting and kind of holding that data, managing that message, and getting everyone in line to make changes to reflect that, right? Or if you don't have that in place, you're effectively just going back to the starting line in March and then running a mini or compressed or terrifyingly short version of your annual process. There's that word again. Short version of your annual process again.
Exciting.
Right? Yeah, there you go. Like
exciting, not terrifying.
I think you're spot on, George. I would say the other thing is technology, right? Like you need a solution. You
Oh yeah.
manage this thing in spreadsheets and emails and duct tape and baling wire, or however you have the, however you're going through this today. It just doesn't work, So like my guess is, like even with a solution, an annual process can still be challenging, but trying to get into this more dynamic situation without some sort of foundation in place, it would be very, very,
yeah.
So we have another question that's come through, and George, I'm guessing you'll probably be the best place for us to start here. Where do you look for benchmark data for compensation cost of sales?
I'm going to get on my soapbox real quick.
Shocked it took this long, George.
Yeah, I know. This is on CCOS. I'm gonna answer a question, a simple question with diatribe. Compensation cost of sales is a great internal metric, right? And use across companies needs to be really, really limited. This is no different than marketing people with Net Promoter Score. Unless you know the organization that you're comparing yourself to is in the exact same business as you are, it has the exact same commercial model, CPG, something like that. Or I remember doing it across earlier in my career across rental car companies, right? Exact same businesses and business model, commercial model. You can make that comparison. If you don't have that exact comparison, it's not to be used. Comp cost of sales is a great internal metric. It also requires, David Hunter's point, a lot of honesty. Who are your real salespeople? Look at them. Look at their base pay. Look at their incentive compensation. Add those spiffs and those one times and those bonuses and those guarantees back into it. Anyone who's ancillary to the commercial process, sales ops, things like that, take them out of it. Compare it to revenue. Revenue is kind of it's over revenue, right? Revenue should be the denominator. However, if you're using it internally, use your metric, right? If it's ACV, if it's FYR, right? Whatever, annual contract value, whatever that metric that you use for top line commercial performance in your organization, use that. So back to the original question, where do you go to get it? There isn't a great place. And we actually, it's not a huge shameless plug because we don't love doing it because it's kind of fraught with peril. But when companies want it, we actually do a custom for them.
All right. I'm sure there's other questions. Feel free to obviously reach out to George and Hunter and myself. We'll be providing our contact information. I would like to thank you both. I anticipated a great conversation and you delivered. It's been, a really interesting discussion. I personally, and I know we live it every day. So to be able to get on the line and talk through it has been fantastic. Again, I believe World at Work has shared the presentation. So if you're interested in the presentation, you should have access to that. And I think I'll turn it back over to Marcos for any final remaining housekeeping.
All right. Thank you, David, Hunter, and George, for sharing your knowledge and time with us today. This webinar will be available for playback for up to 90 days. Simply log into worldatwork.org and access your profile. Please allow 24 hours for the playback to appear. A reminder, we're going to email you a short survey here. We highly appreciate any feedback you can provide us.